Everybody, it's Chris with Life 180, and today I'm going to be doing another breakdown, analysis, review of Doug Andrews' Laser Fund book. We're going to be doing chapter 4 today. What does Laser Fund stand for? So let's get into this. I'm just going to kind of pop right over here and get right into this book. So here's the deal. This is an interesting. So laser, as you can see, it's capitalized here. Would make me think that it stands for an acronym, although he doesn't really get into what the acronym stands for. Laser. He talks about liquidity, safety, tax advantages, but like I don't see where that fits into the laser. Maybe I'm missing something. Happy if anybody has a comment on what that means. Definitely let me know. But he doesn't really go into this and give an example or give the acronym for what it stands for. That said, looking through here, I've just got some fundamentals. He tells a story, talks about the importance of liquidity, safety, rates of return, and tax advantages. Here's the deal. I would agree with all these things being super important. I think this is just another example. Everybody knows I'm a big believer in whole life insurance. This is another example of taking the principles that make whole life insurance amazing at what it is and basically twisting the story and trying to make it applicable for index universal life. I'm going to get into this and in a little more detail as I go through here. So he uses some stories as he goes through here, and he basically says, okay, liquidity. As an illustration, let's say we have a family, the Thompsons, they have extra assets. They don't have a lot of extra assets. They do have a house. They safeguard what they have. They're basically going through, he tells this story about how they buy a house, right? And like the idea of controlling your money, having liquidity, when you have your mortgage, when you have a mortgage, the idea is pay the mortgage off as quickly as possible. That's what a lot of people, that's kind of like the Dave Ramseys of the world. That's probably a core financial principle that they have, is just get out of debt, pay down that principal. But the problem is you have all your money tied up inside of your mortgage. It's not very liquid. And so this is the conversation about liquidity and the importance of having control of that money. And liquidity can lead to opportunity. And he gives examples about what would happen if you took that $100,000 of equity and instead of having it there, put it aside in a financial vehicle that provided liquidity with no income taxes, right? And that's basically where he's going with this. And if you haven't done it, I have a video that I've done on how to pay off your mortgage. The idea, it breaks down all the math behind all of this stuff. So what he's saying here is actually very accurate philosophically. The problem is putting it inside of a index universal life policy is not a predictable, like that's the part about this that he misses. That he's talking about is liquidity, safety, rates of return, tax advantages. Those are all really good, but those need to be done on a predictable basis, and they are not being done on a predictable basis inside of an IUL. I don't care what they're saying, and I'll go through exactly why as we go through this chapter. So here's the deal. Let's see here. I got this circled in red. I got to figure out why. I read this chapter like a week ago, and now I'm circling back to it. But oh yeah. So he's saying you don't have to pay the government any penalties if you choose to cash out your policy earlier. So basically, what he's saying is, listen, this is a whole life or an IUL is what he's saying. A laser fund, which is ultimately a properly structured IUL, as he's saying, gives you benefits, and you can cash it out, you can borrow against it. There's a lot of ways to access the capital ultimately without having tax ramifications, right? So safety, he talks about, he tells a story from the 70s. He is sharing a couple, actually he shares a story about a couple who was in their 70s. They're growing, their mother passes away. All of her money was in Lehman Brothers, and guess what? It was 2008. Lehman Brothers failed. The money went up in smoke. So he tells a story about ultimately how money can just evaporate. And obviously, like if you haven't done your research on this, financial institutions in the life insurance industry, historically speaking, are the safest financial institutions in the world. Now, I'm a little concerned that index universal life companies that are really focusing on that methodology are not as stable as the companies that have been around since the 1840s, right? Like, because when you're focusing on having a whole life platform and focusing on the principles that go along with whole life insurance versus index universal life, it's a completely different methodology on how you're managing things, right? And so the risk and the strategies and how you manage your general account are completely different, right? If you're focused primarily on IUL. That's one of my biggest concerns that I say is, like, typically speaking, what happens is what always happens is when you put your money inside an IUL, you're not really participating directly in the index. You're giving your money to the insurance company, putting it in the general fund, and they're allocating your money according to the index that you choose inside of that IUL. Now, we live in an environment right now where the world is just where it is. We're at all-time low income rate or interest rate environments, right? And so insurance companies right now are having a hard enough time getting 4 to 4.5% on an annual basis in their general fund, right? So all these people like Doug Andrew who are out there saying that you can expect a life insurance company to be able to get you 6% on a predictable basis from here forward. Listen, if it were that easy, if it could be done, the life insurance company would be doing that for themselves. Because if it worked, and it worked predictably, right? Mind you, the life insurance company could do this without all the insurance charges and fees and all that stuff. The only charges they would have would be the cost of the options to be able to do it, right? So if it worked really well with you paying for the insurance charges, the life insurance company would do it without those insurance charges being incurred by themselves, right? So just use common sense. That's all I'm asking people to do here, is like really think about this. Everybody who wants to bang on me and hate on me for all this, if you assume an IUL is going to perform at a 4.5% interest rate, I'm okay with that risk, and you may even have performance that's a little above that. But if you assume and you base an illustration on 6% or higher, even 5.5% or higher, you're setting yourself up for failure. And that's my biggest problem. It's not the problem of an IUL chassis. It's the problem with the expectations around them and how they're sold. So safety, here's the thing. So this is what he's talking about. Safety has two components. The safety of the principal and the safety of the institution in which the money is entrusted. So, i.e. Lehman Brothers failed, that money went up in smoke. So by having your money with an insurance company, it's much safer. I'll agree that it's safer than an investment bank. Even with an IUL, I'll agree with that. But the problem is it's not as safe as it could be, and the principal is not actually as protected as you would think it would be, because there are internal charges in these policies, and that'll make sense as I go through this book. I'm not going to get into that because I'll get off track here. But as you go through this book, he's going to get into more of those topics, and I'll address them as he does, because I'm sure he's going to go there. So what he talks about is he gives an example of what would happen. If you well, I'll just read now. When you talk about safety of principal, ideally what you want to be is able to protect your principal from loss. Even more, you want any gains you've experienced to become newly protected principal. In other words, save $100,000 in a financial vehicle that earns a net rate of 7% this year. At the end of the year, you want to have $107,000 as your newly protected principal, which means even if the market drops and the rate of return is less than zero next year, your principal of $107,000 would be intact. You wouldn't lose a dime due to market volatility. So that, in summary, is just categorically false, because you have expenses and charges inside of the IUL, so it's not that clean as he explains. If you have $100,000 and you're participating in the index, right, and it's a cap of, let's say, 10%, and it's a floor of 0, and let's say it does 7%, you're not participating and realizing all 7% of that. Think about it this way. If you buy an IUL, here's the thing that people need to understand. IULs typically have about a 10-year to 15-year surrender charge, but for the sake of argument, let's just talk about a 10-year surrender period, right? So what happens is, at the beginning of these policies, and I know a lot of people out there right now have policies that are under 10 years old, what happens is they have all these different levers that they move inside of these policies. When you have a policy that's 5 years or less old, you're in the higher portion of the surrender period. So even if you have cash value growing up in them, it's not as liquid because it's in the surrender period. So the amount that's being credited from an indexing perspective is higher than you can actually have liquidity and accessibility to. So when you think about that, that's the other thing where he's going to go to next. Actually, is that this section right here? No, he's talking safety there. So that actually gets into the point of the liquidity thing where he's talking about after. So I'm just going to hop ahead there right now. Is that he talks about later that these are like the most liquid vehicles that exist, but that's just not accurate at all, because when you design these the way that I've seen him design them, you're not extremely liquid. You're in fact, I mean, you don't have a lot of access to that capital. And what he's talking about here with 100,000 in the market going up 7%, you're not participating in all that 7%. Because think about it this way: if I had a $10,000 policy annually, and then 10 years from now, I had put $10,000 a year in and had $100,000. If I'm participating at all 7% of that, then I would have more money on a compounding basis. I would have almost $200,000, right? Because 7,000 compounding, even in simple interest terms, I'd have 170,000, right? So I'd have probably over $200,000 in that scenario. So in this situation, when you look at a properly structured IUL, you're looking at year 10. If you have a 1 to 2.5% internal rate of return annualized over that period of time, that's a really impressive thing. So if you put $100,000 in, after all the surrender charges, after everything comes into the equation, you take everything into consideration, you're talking about the fact that over a 10-year period, you're not even going to be beating inflation typically in one of these policies. Now, not that I would have a problem with that, because when you do with whole life, in all fair comparison, with whole life insurance, it's pretty similar. The fees work differently. The surrender charges, you can design to have a lot more liquidity in a whole life policy. That's why I love whole life for entrepreneurs and for real estate investors and stuff of that nature and people of that sort. But the reason I don't mind it with a whole life policy is because whole life has guarantees that equate it to more of a banking alternative. Index Universal Life has fees and non-guarantees that equate it to more of an investment alternative. And when you compare the two, why am I going to go to get the results that I would get in a whole life policy after 10 years, and take on the risk of an investment portfolio, which is ultimately what you have in, when you're participating in this index. No, you don't have the risk of losing 20-30% of your account value overnight. But when these don't perform the way that they're illustrated, and they don't eat into that net amount at risk from a life insurance perspective, as he talks about later, your fees get higher and higher. The cost of insurance, they can't increase your insurance tables most of the time anymore, but as you get older, the cost of your insurance does get more expensive, right? Just look at the illustration that you were given and ask for a cost of insurance breakdown if you haven't already, because it will show you that on an annual basis, your cost of insurance does go up because you are getting older. It's like annual renewable term. And so if the early stages of your policy don't perform well, or what he does is he likes to fund these things in like 5-year increments typically, and tries to just really jam a lot of money in because it gets them more commission. But then what happens is you're not through the surrender period yet. So after you're done that, fees and expenses eat into the performance of the contract, and it goes from there. Now, should you keep funding if you follow him and you do a strategy? Worst case scenario, if you go that direction, you should just keep funding the policy. That way it doesn't like blow up on itself. But the bottom line is even in this book, he talks about, and it's in the next section, I'll get into it, but he talks about the fact that you can fund these, you can have these fully funded in 5 years, and he presses on that. And listen, I did the Doug Andrew exposed video I did talks about the lawsuit that literally, and you can look in the complaint, in the filing of the lawsuit, 24,000 people complained about the way that he structured policies, and they ended up lapsing because he really leans on this 5-year period of funding mechanism, and that leads to a lot of problems. So rate of return, I just kind of touched on that, is like, Yes, rate of return is really important. The goal is to earn a competitive rate of return that's historically beaten inflation. You know, it's just not doing it in an IUL after you talk about the fees and the expenses and while you're going through that surrender period. My problem with this is that you don't get through the surrender period for about a decade. God only knows where the world's going to be in a decade. So, and once you get into this, you are stuck. Like I've talked to 4 or 5 people. You know, I can't sell them anything. People call me asking for help with these things. Their policies are not performing the way they wanted them to be after 3-4 years. And the problem is they're stuck. Even if I could sell them anything, I couldn't in good faith say, hey, it's the best thing for you to do to move it. You either got to take it on the chin and pay the surrender fees, which these insurance companies know they're going to do. Like they know they got you just trapped when they get you into these policies, because 3, 4, 5 years, once you put 2 years into this, if then you realize you're like, oh my gosh, if I've been paying $20,000 a year on this for 2 years, I either basically have to light that $40,000 on fire, or at least like 30,000 of it, maybe 25,000 of it on fire, or I have to just keep contributing and hopefully more and more will become liquid, and hopefully it continues to do well and the market performs and the index performs and they don't drop my cap rates and all these different variables that come into consideration. Hopefully that stuff doesn't happen. So it's kind of crazy. So liquidity, safety, rate of return, tax advantage. So the laser rating, once again, okay, so then he goes through this chart where he talks about what he's looking for. I'm not going to get into that, like, because I don't want to break down. That's his stuff, whatever. So at the end of the day, top 5 takeaways that he looks for. So number 1, the four fundamentals of prudent financial strategies are liquidity, safety, predictable rates of return, and tax advantages. I would add in there that control is one of the most important parts. And, you know, that goes along with liquidity. And by the way, these are not the most liquid because of the surrender schedule that follows them. The fact that, you know, he's able to say this is just, to me, is horrible. Now, can you structure them to be more liquid? Yes, you can. There are ways to do it. But the thing is, I've probably met 2 or 3 IUL agents in my life that actually structure them where you can do special dump-ins, and not every company can do it. Will allow you to do special non-commissionable premiums that you can put in. But agents typically don't do that because they got to make a living. They make money by selling insurance. And so to sell non-commissionable premiums flies in the face of what they would do. And what I would say is, even if you can do that, get your money in there in non-commissionable premium capacity, it still doesn't work out over the long run as good as you would think it would, because of the fact that you're not in control of a lot of the variables in the policy. So safety, I would agree, safety is super important, but once again, these are not the most safe vehicles. That upside potential, downside protection, if it were that good, I talk about cash value lines of credit. There are banks that go out and lend money to whole life policyholders, leveraging their cash value for lines of credit and saying, hey, we're going to use your cash value in your whole life policy as collateral, and we're going to give you a line of credit tied to that. They won't do that for index universal life insurance. Why? Because it's not as safe. It's not safe at all. And so, and they know that. And so there's a ton of risk, and banks are smarter than your life insurance agent when it comes to managing risk like that. And so if they're not willing to do it, like, to me, it's just common sense. Predictable rates of return, once again, it's not predictable. That's one of the biggest problems with this, is that it's far less predictable, in fact, than they will ever tell you. Tax advantages, yes, there are great tax advantages to this if you can happen to accumulate the cash that you want. My biggest challenge with this overall philosophy, what I've seen, and I don't know, this is a bit conjecture on my perspective right now, but from what I've seen is they deal with a lot of people that are 55 plus dealing with the retirement. IULs, you know how I feel about them in general, but using an IUL for retirement planning when you're 55 plus for income purposes is really bad. I mean, I think it's horrible. There are other vehicles that you can use, because there's going to be so many fees. You're during the surrender period, and you're not going to give your your policy enough time to even get any momentum going for you at all before you're going to need to tap into it for retirement income, and it's going to end up blowing up in your face. So I would say if you're 55 and older and looking at one of these things, totally steer clear of it. Liquidity is the ability to access your money when you need or want it. I agree, that is a great definition. And these things, because of the surrender fees and the surrender charges during the surrender period, are not as liquid as you'd think. Safety relates to your principal, protecting your money from loss due to volatility in the market, and the safety of your financial institution, working with reliable companies that can weather economic storms. Yep, that's working with great companies is important, but that doesn't mean your money's safe, because those companies, the whole idea of IULs, companies are shifting to selling more index universal life because it shifts the burden of risk. When we're selling whole life insurance, all that risk is on the insurance company to meet those guarantees. When they do IULs, look at the contract. All the risk is shifted to you, the policyholder. They can change the fees, the cap rates, the internal expenses, all these different things to make it so your policy doesn't perform, to protect the insurance company so the insurance company doesn't go broke, but you instead have your policy have problems in the process, right? When it comes to the rates of return, you want to earn a competitive rate of return that's historically beaten inflation, and ideally you want the rate of return under tax favorable circumstances. I agree. IULs should do this for you, quite frankly. If you structure them max cash value, minimum death benefit, they will beat that. But I would say if you are looking at an IUL, make sure you call them out and you say, do not run this at more than 4.5%. If you run it at 4.5% and you're happy with what you see, get it, and you'll have some upside, and you'll at least be able to be comfortable and clear on what your realistic results are. Because once again, that's what the insurance company is getting in the general fund. You cannot separate the performance long-term in an IUL from the general fund. And think about common sense. If an insurance company could get 6% for you using this strategy, they would be doing it for themselves in today's low interest rate environment, but they can't. So take that into consideration. Tax advantage financial strategies help you avoid paying unnecessary taxes. Yep, that's true. I talked about the taxes in the last chapter. If you haven't watched it, go back, watch chapter 3. Really good. I actually agree. I think he does a really good job, quite frankly, talking about a lot of the tax stuff. He takes these principles and essentially bastardizes them. It's really, it's horrible. But anyway, that's my breakdown of this section. I still don't get what laser fund stands for, quite frankly. I don't understand. But at the end of the day, I guess that doesn't really matter. So if you found value in this video, go ahead and hit that like button so the algorithm of YouTube sees it, likes it, and gives the video some love. If you haven't already, I'm doing a breakdown of this whole book because I feel like people need clarity on what's going on here. So make sure you hit that subscribe button, hit the bell, that way you get notified every single time I launch a new video. If you have any questions, as always, leave them in the comment section below. I do my best to respond to each and every comment. But yeah, that's it for today. So have a blessed, inspirational day, and I look forward to seeing you on the next video. Take care.